Hello and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. In the last episode, we set out to discover how all the lords of territories across Europe and beyond were doing. We learned about the great Holy Roman Empire ruled by Frederick Barbarossa, and why he and the Pope weren't exactly the best of friends. But now, let's turn our attention to the Iberian Peninsula, starting with our Muslim neighbors to the south. I would just like to remind you that, for those who haven't had the chance to listen to the episodes about the life of King Afonso I, better known as King Afonso Henriques, where we talked about his life in great detail, you can do so via our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com, or via the usual podcasting platforms. You can find all the links to our socials on our website, so stop by and give us a like. It really costs nothing and it helps a lot. So let's get to it. Turning our attention back to the peninsula, we really need to point out something very important. Our idea of the Reconquista is often wrong, and comes from what we learn in school or read about. Correct me if I'm wrong. We usually imagine the Reconquista as a wave crashing on the beach. It comes very quickly and violently, gets all the way up to the shore in the blink of an eye, and then it slowly recedes back into the sea. This is also how we imagine the Muslim conquest and the Christian response. The Muslims invaded the peninsula and, in less than 10 years, reached the northern tip, only to gradually be expelled over the following centuries. But it wasn't exactly like that. There were advances and retreats throughout this time. At times, by taking advantage of the enemy's weaknesses, one side was able to impose itself and claim territory or vassalage, only to eventually fall into chaos themselves, and their rivals would take advantage of the situation. And there were many times when Christians joined forces with Muslims to fight other Christians. And so did the Muslims. Remember Badajoz? The King of Leon allied himself with the Almohads to prevent King Afonso Henriques from conquering that very important city. But we will come back to that in this reign. Historians who study this period tend to see the evolution of the Reconquista as the results of periods of strength and decadence for the Muslims, and not so much for the Christians. This is because there was never a period in which the Christian kingdoms were effectively united, and wars between them were constant. But this was never a decisive factor in explaining their success or failure. The Muslims, on the other hand, depended much more on their unity and stability. During the period in which the Caliphate of Cordoba existed, which was until 1031, the Reconquista progressed almost at a snail's pace and often suffered setbacks, such as when Al-Mansur advanced north in several campaigns that destroyed cities, sacked capitals, and pushed the border back as far as the Douro River, as we have seen before. On 2 occasions, zealot groups, which were fundamentalist, conservative, and militant groups from North Africa, invaded the peninsula and halted or reversed the process of the Reconquista. The first of these groups were the Almoravids, of whom we have already spoken in previous episodes. The other, which we've also talked about from time to time, was the Almohads. In both cases, the Christian kingdoms of the north were hit too hard and suffered heavy defeats. Portugal didn't exist at the time of the Almoravid invasion, but many territories ceded to the Emperor of Hispania, Alfonso VI, were lost after 1086, such as Lisbon, Sintra, Santarém, among others. In fact, as we've already seen, Henry's arrival on the peninsula had a lot to do with Alfonso VI's defeat at the Battle of Zalaca. And now, as we will see, our king Sancho I had to face an Almohad empire at the height of its power, resulting in a huge loss of territory between 1169 and 1191. Please note that this does not mean that Sancho was a weak king. What is true is that all the Christian kingdoms lost territory during this period. For example, Castile suffered a heavy defeat at the Battle of Alarcos, in 1195, and there were fears of the loss of Toledo and the collapse of the kingdom itself. In fact, what you notice when these fundamentalist movements emerge is that for the first few years, they enjoy a momentum and strength that makes them seem unstoppable. But eventually, they collapse very quickly, just like contemporary examples of similar groups. So, let's talk a bit about these two groups, with the Almoravids only being mentioned briefly. The Almoravids were a Tuareg tribe originated in the heart of the Sahara. Inspired by much more fundamentalist teachings of Islam, they argued that the spread of Islam could not only be based on the peaceful conquest and adoption of the faith, but also on the total destruction of enemies, be they heretics, like the Shiites, the Fatimids of Egypt, for example, or infidels, Christians, Black Africans, etc. At the time, there were, as there are now, several fundamental schools in Sunni Islam, some more restricted than others. While the Andalusian Muslims adhere to much milder teachings, cultivating art, culture, drinking wine, etc., the desert peoples, perhaps because of their lifestyle, adhere more readily to more restricted teachings. The division of the Muslim world caused by internal wars and the success of the Christians in Sicily, conquered during the 11th century by the Normans, and in Hispania, the Reconquista convinced some that it was necessary to purify the faith and customs, and that if God didn't favor them, it was because he was angry at them for deviating from doctrine. Hence the success of these fundamentalist movements everywhere. But it also meant the gradual end of the Islamic Golden Age and the end of Islam as the greatest scientific and cultural power in the medieval world. The Almoravid movement emerged in the desert around 1040, but quickly spread south, more specifically, into the interior of Africa, and north towards Morocco. In 1062, the Almoravids founded a new city to be their capital, Marrakesh. There, they claimed the title of Princes of the Muslims, but not that of Caliphs, thus coming under the authority of the Abbasids in Baghdad. By the year 1082, all the territory from the Senegal River and the edge of the Sahara to Algiers in the Maghreb had been conquered. And in 1086, answering the call for help from the Taifa kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, the Almoravids advanced against Alfonso VI and defeated him in the Battle of Zalaca. By now, we know the rest. A few years later, they landed on the peninsula again, but this time with the aim of conquering both Muslims and Christians, until their power was spent in wars against the Iberian kingdoms, against their neighbors in Africa, and in rebellions that began to break out. A few years later, everything began to fall apart. In 1118, Alfonso I of Aragon conquered Zaragoza, a very important Muslim city. Over the next few years, he launched several military campaigns of plunder and even reached the gates of Granada and Cordoba. The Almoravids' authority was based on their victories and their ability to stop the Christians. When that failed, the peninsular population quickly turned against them. We talk about this in more detail in the second episode of the series on King Afonso I of Portugal. In the 1120s, the Almohads appeared in Morocco and would destroy and replace the Almoravid Empire. If the Almoravids were the Windows 10 of fundamentalism, the Almohads were the upgrade and became Windows 11, specializing in cleaning up some of the viruses that the old system had picked up in the meantime. One of them was a taste for wine. Among the first actions of Ibn Tumart, the founder of this new sect, to spread his doctrine was to organize riots against wine cellars and wine stores all over Ifriqiya, which was in Muslim North Africa, where Tunisia and parts of Algeria and Libya are today. This was because the Almoravids had fallen into the same sin that they had sworn to eliminate. In other words, if they couldn't trust the Almoravids to clean their house, so to speak, and they didn't like the overly liberal ideas of the Abbasid caliphs sitting comfortably on their golden throne in Baghdad. What could they do? They thought, well, in that case, we'll found a new empire and declare ourselves caliphs. Incredibly, this is exactly what the Almohads did when they took power. In 1133, when they were still little more than a rebel group in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, their second leader, Abd al-Mumin, proclaimed himself caliph. He then proceeded to cut ties with the Abbasids, asserted himself as the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, and attracted many tribes to his cause. Within a few years, the Almoravids would be completely crushed. It was during this period of war between the Almoravids and the Almohads, in which the former collapsed and the latter had not yet managed to establish themselves well, that the Christians made their greatest advances, and King Afonso Henriques conquered all the territory he could during his reign. But the Almohads' response, as soon as they managed to get back on their feet, would come sooner rather than later. In the case of Portugal, it happened from 1180 onwards, and was even stronger in 1191, when King Sancho I and the entire Portuguese kingdom endured a huge scare. All of this serves to explain that the history of a country or a people can never be analyzed on its own, without the risk of drawing the wrong conclusions. When we observe the Portugal of King Sancho I in an isolated fashion, it seems that his reign was a failure, or a waste of time. But, realizing that all the peninsular Christian kingdoms lost territory at this time, in fact, in 1187, even the Holy Land Jerusalem fell, and the Christian kingdoms there were practically destroyed, Sancho didn't just lose what his father had conquered south of the Tagus River. He was also important in consolidating what he managed to keep. No wonder we call him the Populator. During his reign, he granted charters to many villages, taking special care with those on the borders, encouraging settlement and defense, in order to consolidate these territories in the hands of Portugal and prevent the neighbours from claiming them. Let's now talk about the Christian kingdoms of the peninsula. One of the most important notions for understanding the evolution of these kingdoms is their political ascendancy. Because we began our narrative of King Afonso Henriques in the period of the Reconquista, between Al-Mansur and Ferdinand the Great, this idea has not been sufficiently established. The peninsular states of the 12th and 13th centuries had two distinct origins, Hispano-Gothic and Frankish. Navarre, formerly known as Pamplona, found itself in a kind of limbo between these two, although it stuck more closely to the Hispano-Gothic tradition, at least in the early stages. But why, you ask? Well, because at the same time as the Kingdom of Asturias was being formed and consolidated, Charlemagne, king of the Franks and later Emperor of the West, undertook campaigns against the north of the peninsula beyond the Pyrenees, with the intention of forming a buffer zone between his empire and the lands of the Saracens to the south. At the end of his reign, and after some bad luck, he managed to create and consolidate what was known as the Hispanic March, a territory in the northeast of the peninsula that descended from the Pyrenees to near the Ebro Valley and included Barcelona itself. This territory was divided into a series of counties, with Aragon initially being just one of them. Due to their Frankish origins, the Catalan counties and Aragon preserved until the end of the Middle Ages certain traditions and laws that the rest of the peninsula did not follow. For example, they applied the Salic law, a law which determined that women could not inherit the throne, or rather, in the case of Aragon, they could, but their properties, titles, and rights would be administered by their husbands. A curious note, this law was so firm that, even by the end of the 15th century, Ferdinand II of Aragon, married to Isabella of Castile, tried to declare their daughter heir to the Aragonese territories, but was unable to do so. The Kingdom of Asturias and its descendants, on the other hand, followed more local traditions, so to speak, as some authors call them Hispano-Goths. and they were perfectly able to accept women on the throne as long as there were no male relatives of equal rank. Having said that, let's take a look at what happened in these kingdoms during the second half of the 12th century. Let's start with Aragon. We spoke earlier about the Salic law. That law now came to the fore when Ramiro II of Aragon, brother and successor of Alfonso I, the Battler, who died in 1134, was literally removed from the monastery where he served in order to ascend the throne. If you'd like to find out more about Alfonso I the Battler, listen to our first and second episode of the Afonso Henriques series. There we talk more in detail about his life and the impact he had on the Iberian Peninsula. Going back to his brother, Ramiro II of Aragon, between 1134 and 1137, he married, had a daughter, separated from his wife, and tried to find a fiancé for his daughter, little Petronilla, who was just 1 year old. The groom turned out to be Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Barcelona, a young man of less than 25 years of age who, in exchange for marrying and being able to rule in Aragon almost as if he were king, changed his surname to of Aragon, effectively extinguishing the lineage of the Counts of Barcelona. The union of these two would give birth to the little Alfonso II of Aragon, who was born in 1157, and who would begin to reign more or less at the same time as Sancho I began to co-rule in Portugal. With him came the union of the Kingdom of Aragon with the County of Barcelona, and, given that Aragon already ruled over 2 other Catalan counties, the Crown of Aragon was born, effectively reducing the remaining counties to vassalage. Along with Aragon, Navarre was also undergoing changes. The death of Alfonso I the Battler, King of Aragon and Pamplona, caused the 2 crowns to separate, leading to the restoration of the throne of Navarre. Both kingdoms became vassals of Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile, who, in the year following Alfonso of Aragon's death, was able to assert himself as the suzerain of these kingdoms and proclaim himself emperor, as we saw in episode 2 of the Afonso Henriques series. Therefore, over the following years, Navarre and Aragon, and by extension the Catalan counties, found themselves in an awkward position as kingdoms, as they were under the authority of the Emperor of Spain, as was Portugal since 1143. The death of Alfonso VII in 1157 served as a new cry for independence for these kingdoms, but it also meant that the now separated kingdoms of Leon and Castile would try to reassert the superiority they had enjoyed when they were united. Because of this, Navarre suffered several invasions and wars against Castile, and Aragon sought refuge by trying to marry off little Alfonso II to a princess from Portugal. This marriage would not take place due to the death of little Mafalda, Afonso Henriques' 4th daughter, in 1162, but it would lead to another, that our king, Sancho I, with an Aragonese princess, who would become the 2nd queen of Portugal. Let's now travel to Castile. Recapping what we've already covered in our series on King Afonso Henriques, after the death of Alfonso VII, 2 brothers ascended the throne of the 2 kingdoms, Sancho III in Castile and Ferdinand II in Leon. Both decided to recover the Hispanic supremacy that their father had enjoyed, and in 1158 they signed what became known as the Treaty of Sahagún. In this treaty, each kingdom's area of conquest was defined, with Leon having the right to the lands between Lisbon and Niebla, and Castile the rest. But what about Portugal? Well, Portugal would be reabsorbed by these 2 kingdoms, especially Leon due to its proximity, annulling what had been stipulated at Zamora in 1143. So, while we can say in episode 4 of the Afonso Henriques series that the death of Alfonso VII was a boon for Afonso Henriques, allowing him to get rid of his overlord, it was also a huge concern. Portugal alone didn't have the capacity to deal with Leon and Castile together. which is why Portugal looked to Aragon for an ally, and Aragon was looking for the same in Portugal because it feared Castile. But this project of the Central Kingdoms wouldn't come to fruition because Sancho III of Castile died very soon afterwards, leaving little Alfonso VIII on the throne at just 3 years old. A curious note, this Alfonso VIII was exactly 1 year younger than our Sancho, having been born on November the 11th of 1155. And remember this name because it will accompany us throughout 2 reigns. Now, Ferdinand and the late Sancho had also stipulated in the Treaty of Sahagun that if one of the 2 died without descendants, the other would take the throne and reunite the kingdoms. The thing is that there were descendants, but they were only 3 years old, and this didn't seem to matter much for Ferdinand, who spent the next 10 years plotting and even waging open war against the young king's advisors in a clear attempt to reduce Castile to submission and perhaps annex it in the future. Against this threat, Alfonso VIII of Castile tried to create a web of alliances. On the one hand, he tried to improve his relationship with Portugal, which had been tarnished by the consequences of Sahagun. On the other hand, he organized a double marriage in order to create allies in the east. He married his aunt Sancha, who was still young, to Alfonso II of Aragon, and, at the same time, he himself married Eleanor of England, daughter of Henry II of England, at a time when the aforementioned Angevin Empire was at its most splendid. As for Ferdinand II, we'll have the opportunity to talk more about him as our narrative of King Sancho I unfolds, but suffice to say that his attempt to gain supremacy in the peninsula took up a large part of his reign. If, on the one hand, he failed in his attempt to reabsorb Portugal and did not achieve the longed-for supremacy over Castile, he did create an entirely new order of chivalry that would become one of the main forces to successfully end the course of the Reconquista, the Order of Santiago, in 1170. And because he was too busy with his Christian neighbors, he signed an alliance with the Almohads in 1168, which prevented him from taking an active part in the Reconquista and even saw his own father-in-law, Afonso Henriques, march on Badajoz, as we also saw in episode 4 of the Afonso Henriques series. In a way, if we want to abuse anachronism, Ferdinand II seems like some sort of traitor to the Reconquista. While the other peninsular kings sought to defeat the Almohads, Leon remained an ally of the invaders during part of this period, apparently oblivious to, or even happy, with the misfortunes of his Christian co-religionists, and more concerned with becoming the largest of these kingdoms than expanding against the Muslims. Finally, we end up in Portugal, a self-proclaimed kingdom after the victory at Ourique. It saw its status recognized by its neighbors after Zamora in 1143. But that didn't necessarily imply the future-proofing of its independence. The same monarchs who call you king today can invade you tomorrow and call you a slave the following day. Only one entity could guarantee Portugal's immunity from conquest or the machinations of its neighbors, and that entity was the Pope. And his recognition took a long time, so that between 1157, when Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile died, and 1179, when the bull Manifestus Probatum was finally issued, the kingdom went through several difficult situations and some very dark times. Leon was a kingdom that based its superiority on being the successor to Asturias and on the existence of Santiago of Compostela. Castile, more recent, had in its favor the fact that it had the city that had been the capital of a united Hispania, Toledo. Compared to them, Portugal had nothing except a king who, until 1169, had enjoyed a kind of an aura of invincibility and enormous prestige even among the Muslims, who called him the perfidious Ibn Arik. And after 1169, even that aura crumbled. These were not going to be easy times for the kingdom, and it was now Sancho, at the helm alongside his father, who was going to dive into the eye of the storm. So let's start talking about our Sancho as a ruler. Something he began while his father was still alive. But why? Due to one reason and one culprit. If you've heard episode 5 of King Afonso Henriques, you know exactly what we are talking about. The reason was to ensure peaceful succession. At this time, as hard as it is to imagine, succession in monarchies was still not very well defined and depended a lot on local tradition. For example, the Frankish kings were in the habit of dividing up their territory upon their death among their male children, and, as we have seen, through the Salic law, preventing women from exercising power or even owning property. In the peninsula, things were much more liberal, but the Visigothic ways had long determined that kings had to be elected and acclaimed by the assembly of the people. In other words, heredity didn't necessarily take precedence. At the time of the Reconquista, we had a mixture of these traditions. That's why some kings left everything to a successor and others divided what they had among their sons and daughters. But we also had kings being recognized by the assemblies of the nobles, breaking up previous dynasties. We can see how this was particularly difficult in the Portuguese case. Afonso Henriques was the first king of a new kingdom. He had even less certainty about what would happen after he died. Therefore, associating the eldest son with ruling side by side with his father was a way of ensuring that these problems wouldn't happen. As for the culprit, well, it was that damned bolt on the door in Badajoz, remember? Our beloved founding king broke his leg fleeing the city of Badajoz when he realized that he had been betrayed by his own Leonese co-religionists, and according to the documents of the time, he was never able to recover, although there are versions to suit all tastes in the chronicles of the time, and the chronicles from across the border are particularly imaginative. Let's take a look at this example. According to some Leonese and Castilian chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries, King Afonso Henriques wasn't injured that badly. It was just a flesh wound. What happened, according to them, was that he was captured, held prisoner for those 2 months, and, during that time, promised to give the whole kingdom to his son-in-law, Ferdinand II, if he could ride a horse again. Of course, Ferdinand II, being a Christian with exuberant honor, as can be seen from his alliance with the Muslim ruler of Badajoz to prevent its conquest by Afonso Henriques and thus betraying the Reconquista movement, refused the offer, only returning the cities of Toronho and Limia and surrendering the territories around Badajoz to the Almohads. However, it was established that if Afonso Henriques could ride again, he would be a vassal of Leon. As such, the Leonese and Castilian chronicles say that he pretended to be injured for the rest of his life. For our king, riding a horse was an impossibility, so he was never able to lead the troops again. And one of the king's main tasks, as we saw earlier, was to be a military leader. So if the father can't do it, the son has to take on the task. In addition, King Afonso Henriques spent some time recovering in the springs near Coimbra, but not exactly far from everything either. And the embryonic royal chancellery that existed was in Coimbra. It was the monks of the Monastery of the Holy Cross. So, when his father went away to heal his body, it was probably Sancho who took care of the government of the kingdom. We now conclude our journey throughout Europe and the Western kingdoms, where we have talked about what is really going on out there, what exists, and what is happening beyond Portugal in these troubled times. We've also given you a taste of what our next episodes will be like, where we'll get to know in detail the life of our second King of Portugal, King Sancho I. Don't miss the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.